Welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, and the head alchemist of Birdseye, Indiana's own Old Homestead Distillery, Alan Bishop. From our hearts and hearts to yours, we love telling these stories, and if you remember, we are actually continuing the story of my favorite ghost, John A. Bowman, the one who first tapped me on the shoulder, and then cued me into some other ghosts that I've told stories about since then. At least that is my gut feeling of the situation. If you remember, John had just passed away, and we said the interesting part was yet to come. John passes away in September of 1886 after a long illness that he sustained due to fighting a fence fire on his farm. Likely some type of pneumonia or something of that nature, probably aggravating some pre-existing condition, but he lingered around for some time before he passed. In this time period, he had expressed to his wife that he wanted to be buried next to the track so he could feel that train rattle his old bones. And to this day, when we are researching historical characters and subjects, I still call it rattling old bones when I find something new or some strange synchronicity or high strangeness happens around me. That is the art of rattling old bones. So you have to remember that when John died, there was a lot of interest in spiritualism. There was a lot of interest in potential reanimation. Science, via what was seen at the World's Fairs, was looking more and more like magic. And anyone with the right amount of money might have thought that they were coming back. And I certainly believe that John certainly thought that he was coming back. And I'll tell you a bit about that momentarily. What I will also say is that the cemetery at the Bowman farm is actually much larger than it appears to be. We don't know how large it was. We don't know who all was buried there. We don't know if some of the workmen perhaps were buried there, some more of the family, etc. We do know that in the 20th century, as the farm passed into multiple different hands, at one point in time, there was a farmer who wanted to get rid of the cemetery and did attempt to bulldoze it out, leaving only Bowman's grave standing, his gravestone standing. What we do know is that once we researched the Bowman Cemetery, we realized pretty quickly that John's wife was actually buried beside him years later when she passed away, and money was left for a stone for her, but either a stone was never placed or it was bulldozed out. It's entirely possible that the stone was never placed. One of her relatives, and I won't say who because he's within living memory, had a bad habit of squandering family money and may have squandered that money instead of spending it to actually give a proper burial where it was due. That is a distinct possibility. The other thing is, we never could find a burial record for John's father. We strongly suspect that perhaps John's father is buried next to John as well. And when the cemetery commission came out and did probing, and I came out and did dowsing, we did find at least 3 graves in the vicinity. Very easily identifiable graves. So it could be that John's father is buried there as well. We know, for example, that the timbers in the house, most of the floor timbers, were cut much earlier than Bowman built the house, meaning that either there was a structure already on the site that was much older, and I think we were talking somewhere around 30 years older than what the house was, the house being built in the mid-1840s, or that those timbers were brought in from elsewhere, perhaps, although it's a long ways away, from Walnut Ridge where John grew up. That is a distinct possibility. We do not know. I do know also that while I was working on the house and tearing out the kitchen floor, that the timbers in the kitchen floor showed me that the kitchen was added later on, only a couple years later on. And the reason I know this is because the kitchen floor was very clearly made out of old railroad cross ties, dating to probably the period when the railroad was placed there. So John was making use of local resources where he could make use of those. In terms of John's burial and the reason that I believe that he thought he was coming back, John was laid in state in the foyer of the house. The foyer of the house. I probably said that word wrong. I don't care. It doesn't matter. And he was laid in state in a very curious contraption. The Fisk metallic cask. If you're not familiar with the Fisk metallic cask, look it up. It was a very expensive device, an airtight casket, looking much like an Egyptian sarcophagus, with a viewing window that could be open. There was a piece of glass there, but there was a piece of metal that would slide across the glass. This Fisk metallic cask guaranteed that the body would stay in perfect preservation, at least according to their advertisement. Now, some that have been exhumed have been in a great state of preservation, and some have been completely decimated by time and the elements. The cask could be filled with inert gas, or it could be filled with alcohol. In John's case, it was filled with alcohol. And the reason I know this is because I have actually seen the records from the company in Salem, Indiana, through a good friend of mine who is now gone, John Hughes, of exactly what Bowman requested for his burial. The cask was filled with alcohol, laid out in the home. People came to visit. His friends carried the cask down to the graveyard. He was the first interment in Washington County to actually have a vault placed around it, the very first. And that's where things get interesting. The obelisk having the symbolism that it already inherently has, the way that it's set up, the directionality of it, etc. But to this Fisk metallic cask, through the vault, were attached 4 copper wires to 4 copper ground rods in the 4 cardinal directions. Almost as though John thought that perhaps there could be some use for attracting lightning to him. We don't really know why he did this, just that he did do it, and it was specifically requested. His burial was crazy expensive for the time, costing somewhere in the realm of $100,000. As you can imagine, this was an opulent expense for a burial at that time. Now, why do I call Mr. Bowman my favorite ghost? How do I even know Mr. Bowman is a ghost? I'll give you a few reasons. When I first started distilling, well, not when I first started, but when I got really interested in the art of distillation and I came up with my first mash bill, what would later become known as the Lee W. Sinclair mash bill, which was released both at Copper and Kings and Spirits of French Lick. It wasn't released as Lee Sinclair at Copper and Kings. It wasn't even released by Copper and Kings. It was released by a company called Mic Drop up in New York. I was looking for a name, and I knew I wanted to use something historical. This was long before becoming a legal distiller. I knew the little bit of the story of John Bowman. I knew that the locals called his old mansion that was crumbling along the railroad tracks the Governor's Mansion. I'd grown up seeing his grave, walking and hunting the tracks. I'd grown up seeing the house and exploring the house, walking along the tracks, and I'd had some experiences in the house. Nothing major. But one day, after distilling a fresh batch of this particular whiskey, I decided to take a trip up the tracks. I decided I was going to call this whiskey John Bowman, not knowing about the Bowman Distilling Company out in Virginia. But I wanted to take John a bottle, something I still do to this day. Bottle number 1 of everything goes to the grave. Bottle number 2 goes to the house. Bottle number 3 goes to a family member or someone who has reenacted that character throughout the years. So I took the little hike up the tracks and checked out the house, checked out the grave. Nothing too awful strange that day. But as time went on, I sort of became the preeminent historian when it came to matters of John A. Bowman, and ended up writing an article about John A. Bowman, which actually helped to sell the house, which was in dire need of repair as one of the sides was beginning to sag. That side of the house had actually sagged since it was built and had a lot of work done to it over the years, but the house was in need of a buyer through Indiana Landmarks. The people who ended up buying the house found my article and happened to be friends with people who bought another historic house in the local area. And so they hired me to help do some of the demolition work to the floors and the various things that needed to come down, the horsehair plaster off the walls where it had been wet and damp and moldy over the years, which meant I got to spend a lot of time at the Bowman house. Later I helped run the electricity with a good friend of mine. But I spent many hours alone in that house, and I got to explore that entire property to my heart's content and look for various different pieces of hidden history, of which I found a lot, and of which I will not tell you all of which I've not even told all of to the owners. Maybe they know about some of these things, maybe they do not know about some of these things. But I can tell you, I have heard the boots of Mr. Bowman walk across the floor of that ballroom upstairs multiple times. While ripping out the kitchen floor, I heard very clearly and very distinctly the voice of a little boy and a little girl playing outside. The same as you could imagine a little boy and a little girl playing outside now, playing with a ball or something of that nature, laughing, giggling, having a good time, and talking back and forth. This house is in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing around it. Walking outside the house, there was nothing around it at that time. I chalk it up to John's little brother and little sister. Although they didn't die in the house, some of their quintessence definitely rubbed off on the house and the environment thereof. Sort of like a playback ghost, a little bit like playing a tape back, electromagnetism and all of that stuff. I was ripping out an added bathroom, having known the story about, obviously, the gutters that I mentioned before, the membrane gutters and the cistern, but not knowing where the cistern was. I had noticed that there were a number of trash bags outside this bathroom. As I went to pull the shower stall out, I stepped backwards, and my leg went into a hole that I presumed was a groundhog hole. I tried to get out of the hole and couldn't. My other leg went in. I happened to just catch myself just right that I was able to eventually crawl out of that hole. Once crawling out of that hole and investigating closer, it was that 30-foot cistern. At this time, cell phone networks aren't what they are now, and I barely had any signal anyways. If I had fallen in that hole and broken my leg or died, who knows when someone would have found me if they would have. It was a miracle of some sort that I didn't fall completely in that hole. It's almost as though Mr. Bowman wanted me to know that it was there without causing me an issue. At another point, once I got interested in Mr. Bowman's potential connections to the Underground Railroad, I was investigating the basement. The basement was always interesting to me. It's more of a cellar than a basement. I found the wall that I spoke of with the names carved into it, the initials carved into it, etc. It had to come down. It was a half wall behind it with room enough to set. You could have hid several people in there if you needed to. But I was investigating the floor of the cellar, which was a dirt floor. You know, people drop coins, they drop various articles here and there, etc. I did find many things in the house, old medicine bottles. I'm pretty sure I know the exact place where John Bowman's deathbed was at in that house, and where a medicine cabinet had fallen over the years. The bottles dating to the exact time that he would have passed away, and also relating to the illness that we know that he passed away from. But in that cellar, as I was looking around and becoming more and more investigatory, I started sort of digging around that dirt. And now I wasn't digging with a shovel, I was just taking my hand and moving some dirt around. Something didn't like how curious I was getting in that basement, and a rock flew from one side of that basement to the other side of that basement and hit the wall. And when it hit the wall, it made a hell of a noise, and it had some force behind it. I came out of that basement real quick. I'm pretty sure I never touched the steps on the way up that basement. And when I got to the top, I apologized to Mr. Bowman, and I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bowman, I will not dig in your basement anymore." Another interesting aside is that Mr. Bowman seemed to have a very good relationship with my father, Dale Bishop. My dad could come up to what is now the front side of the house. In Bowman's day, it was the back side of the house, to the room where Bowman probably died at, which had been divided into multiple rooms at one point in time. But there was a door for a screened-in porch, and then there was the door to the actual house with a transom window above it and to the sides, etc. Now, granted, there was no latch left on this door anymore. But if that door was closed, if my dad walked up to the house, the door would open. My dad would always say, "Hello, Mr. Bowman," before he ever got to the door, and the door would open. My dad walked out of the house, and he said, "Goodbye, Mr. Bowman." Without ever touching the door would close. Now, the reason I call Mr. Bowman my favorite ghost is because I feel like since I found his story and I told his story and I brought him back to the light of day, all the way down to finding a reenactor to play him at one point in time at a local festival, ever since that moment, other ghosts have tapped me on the shoulder. And many of those ghosts were directly related to Mr. Bowman. Many of those ghosts didn't have their stories told, or at least not told properly, in the Washington County history books. And I credit that completely to Mr. John Bowman, because I think, as a spirit, he told these other spirits, "You want your story told? I know who can tell it." And I know that sounds crazy, and I'm okay with that, because I probably am a little crazy. But I like to share those sort of stories. Magic and spirituality is around us at all times. And Mr. John Bowman helped to reawaken that in me some years ago. The whiskey that would have bared his name, for example, ended up bearing the name of Lee W. Sinclair. Bowman helped Sinclair get his start in the banking industry. Sinclair helped Charles Edward Ballard get his start in the gaming and banking industry. Three men, all part of same fraternities, passing it from one to the next. No relationship as far as blood goes, which is probably good, because while blood's thicker than water, it's harder to clean up. They took care of each other and they helped each other get started in the business, one to the next, all of whom I named whiskeys after. I think that kind of sums up the John Bowman story for now. There's other stories I could tell, other pieces of this history I could tell, but if you want to find more of it, there is a little more of it out there. If you go to the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, episode 1 is all about John A. Bowman. From our hearts and hearts to yours at Old Homestead, we love y'all. Later.